How did people living at the edge of the known world endure months of darkness when the sun barely rose above the horizon and winter nights seemed endless? For the Vikings of the far north, darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was a force that shaped every aspect of life. From late autumn to early spring, especially in Scandinavia's northern reaches, daylight shrank to a pale glow that lasted only hours, sometimes minutes. Beyond the Arctic Circle, the sun disappeared entirely, leaving families, farms, and longhouses wrapped in near-constant night. Survival during these polar nights depended on more than courage or strength. It depended on light, carefully managed, fiercely protected, and deeply understood. In a world without electricity, gas, or modern fuels, light was precious. It meant safety from unseen dangers, the ability to work, cook, repair tools, and tend animals. It meant warmth for the eyes and reassurance for the mind. Darkness brought fear, cold, and isolation, but the Vikings learned to push it back using what their harsh environment offered in abundance: animals, oil, and fire. The foundation of Viking light came from animals. Every hunt, every slaughter, every successful fishing expedition was not only about meat and hides, but about fat. Animal fat was life. From seals taken along icy coasts, from whales stranded or hunted at sea, from cattle, sheep, and goats raised through careful seasonal planning, fat was rendered, stored, and rationed with the same seriousness as food itself. Fat fed bodies, but it also fed flames. In autumn, as daylight faded, Viking households prepared for darkness. Inside longhouses, families rendered fat by slowly heating it over fires, separating usable oil from connective tissue and impurities. This was labor-intensive, smoky work, filling homes with thick smells that clung to clothes and hair. But the result was vital, a supply of burnable fuel that would last through winter. Unlike wood, which burned quickly and unevenly for light, animal fat could be controlled, stretched, and used efficiently. Lamps made from stone, clay, or hollowed metal were common across the Viking world. These were not elaborate objects, but practical tools shaped by experience. A shallow bowl held liquid fat or oil, while a wick, often made from twisted moss, plant fibers, or wool scraps, drew the fuel upward to sustain a small flame. The flame was never meant to flood a room with brightness. Instead, it created islands of light in a sea of shadow, enough to see hands, faces, and immediate surroundings. The quality of light mattered. Different fats burned differently. Seal oil, widely used in coastal communities, burned relatively clean and bright, producing steady light with minimal smoke. Whale oil, rarer and more valuable, offered long burn times and a strong flame, but required careful handling. Domestic animal fats, such as tallow from cattle or sheep, were easier to obtain but smoked more heavily and required frequent trimming of wicks. These differences were well known, passed down through generations not as written knowledge, but as lived experience. Light was also communal. In longhouses, a central hearth provided both heat and illumination, but side lamps extended visibility beyond the fire's reach. Families gathered close together, not only for warmth, but because light diminished quickly with distance. The far ends of a hall often remained in shadow, used for storage or sleeping, while daily life clustered near the glow. Shadows flickered across wooden beams and carved posts, giving life to stories, fears, and beliefs. The psychological weight of darkness was immense. During the long polar nights, the world beyond the door seemed to vanish. Snow-absorbed sound, skies remained star-filled or clouded, and the boundary between night and day blurred. Light became a marker of time and routine. Lamps were lit at familiar moments, during meals, during storytelling, during careful evening work like mending nets or carving tools. These rituals anchored people, reminding them that time still moved forward even when the sun did not rise. Firelight shaped Viking culture as much as it shaped survival. Around the hearth and lamps, stories were told, sagas of gods who battled darkness itself, of journeys across black seas, of heroes who carried light into unknown lands. The struggle against darkness was mirrored in mythology. Flames were not just tools, they were symbols of order against chaos, of human presence against the vast, indifferent night. Oil and fat also influenced architecture. Longhouses were designed to trap light as well as heat. Low ceilings, darkened walls stained by smoke, and narrow openings reduced drafts but also intensified the glow of flames. Light reflected off polished bone tools, metal fittings, and even the sheen of oil-soaked wood, Everything in the space worked together to amplify limited illumination. Windows, when present at all, were small and covered with thin animal membranes or horn, allowing faint daylight to filter through without letting in the cold. Outside, light was rare and used sparingly. Torches made from resin-soaked wood or wrapped bundles of fat-soaked material provided short-lived brightness for necessary tasks, tending animals, checking traps, or moving between buildings. These torches were expensive in terms of fuel, and their use was carefully judged. Most movement happened by memory and touch, paths known so well they could be followed in near-total darkness. The control of light was also a matter of social status. Wealthier households had more animals, more fat, and thus more light. Their halls glowed longer into the night, allowing extended feasts, craftsmanship, and social gatherings. Poorer families lived with dimmer lamps and shorter evenings, retreating to sleep earlier not by choice, but by necessity. Light, like food, reflected hierarchy, yet even among the wealthy, nothing was wasted. Wick trimmings were saved, burnt residue was scraped and reused when possible. Lamps were extinguished the moment they were no longer needed. Children grew up understanding that light was finite, that every flame consumed part of their future comfort. This awareness created discipline, patience, and respect for resources, traits essential for survival in the north. Oil also bridged seasons. In summer, when daylight stretched endlessly and lamps were unnecessary, the work of collecting and preserving fat intensified. Seal hunts, fishing expeditions, and livestock management were planned with winter light in mind. The brightness of summer was deceptive. It existed to prepare for darkness. The Vikings lived in a constant cycle of storing light for times when it could not be found in the sky. As winter deepened and polar nights took hold, lamps burned longer each day. The sound of dripping oil, the faint hiss of flame, and the rhythmic trimming of wicks became part of daily life. Smoke darkened ceilings and blackened beams, but it also preserved wood and deterred pests. Even the byproducts of light had purpose. Light influenced sleep patterns as well. Without strong artificial illumination, people slept in segments, waking briefly during the night when lamps were relit for small tasks or quiet conversation. Darkness was not something to defeat entirely, but something to coexist with. The Vikings did not try to turn night into day. They learned how to live within its limits. Outside the longhouse, the polar night transformed the landscape into a realm of shadows and silence. Ice reflected moonlight and starlight, creating faint, cold illumination that guided travelers across frozen ground. Snowfields glowed softly under the aurora, adding an otherworldly presence to the darkness. These natural lights were unpredictable, beautiful, and useless for work, but they shaped how people understood the night, not as empty, but as alive. Animal fat and oil were therefore more than fuels. They were the foundation of endurance. They allowed communities to remain active, productive, and socially connected through months when darkness could have crushed morale. They turned hunted animals into stored sunlight, captured and released drop by drop. As the weeks of winter stretched on, light became a quiet promise that the sun would return, that stored fat would last, that flames would continue to rise from wicks each evening. The Vikings measured survival not in days, but in how long their oil supplies held, how steady their lamps burned, and how well they could keep darkness at bay without exhausting what little they had. And as the polar night pressed closer, deepening and lengthening, the simple glow of an oil lamp became the most powerful tool in the Viking world, fragile, flickering, and absolutely essential, carrying them forward into the heart of winter, where light, once mastered, would face its greatest test. As winter settled fully over the north, darkness ceased to be a temporary condition and became the permanent state of the world. Days no longer shortened. They simply vanished. In this stage of the polar night, light was no longer a comfort but a necessity that demanded constant management. Viking communities adjusted their rhythms completely, shaping daily life around the careful use of animal fat, oil, and flame, knowing that a single mistake could mean weeks of hardship. Inside the longhouse, the balance between light and air became delicate. Oil lamps consumed oxygen and released smoke, so flames could never be too large or too numerous. Ventilation was limited, and opening doors or roof vents invited brutal cold inside. Families learned exactly how many lamps could burn safely at once, how high wicks could be trimmed, and how far apart flames needed to be spaced. These were not written rules but instinctive knowledge, developed through generations of winter survival. Children, grew up watching elders tend lamps with almost ritual care. Wicks were adjusted with bone or metal tools, never fingers, to avoid wasting oil or extinguishing the flame. If a wick burned too high, it produced smoke that stung eyes and blackened walls. If it burned too low, the flame faltered and died, leaving the room suddenly blind. Every adjustment mattered, and every movement was deliberate. Animal fat storage became as critical as food storage. Rendered oils were kept in sealed containers made from wood, leather, or ceramic, protected from freezing temperatures that could solidify them into unusable masses. In the coldest months, oils were often kept near sleeping areas or close to the hearth, where body heat and residual warmth kept them fluid. The household's survival depended on keeping these reserves usable at all times. Coastal Viking settlements relied heavily on marine mammals during this period. Seal oil in particular proved invaluable. It burned longer and brighter than most land animal fats and remained workable at lower temperatures. Communities near the sea structured their winter life around this advantage. Lamps fueled by seal oil allowed longer evenings of work, including net repair, tool sharpening, and the slow production of textiles that would be needed when spring returned. Inland communities adapted differently. Without easy access to marine oil, they relied more heavily on tallow from livestock. This required constant attention. Tallow burned unevenly and demanded frequent wick maintenance. In many homes, a single person, often an older family member, was responsible for lamp care during long evenings, freeing others to work or rest. This role carried quiet importance, for the failure of a lamp meant darkness for everyone. Light shaped social behavior during the polar night. People gathered closer together, not only for warmth, but to remain within the lamp's reach. Conversation became softer, movements slower. Shadows at the edges of the room remained deep and unmoving, while faces near the flame flickered with life. The limited radius of light created an intimate world, one where relationships intensified and conflicts could not be easily avoided or ignored. Storytelling became more than entertainment. It was a psychological tool. In the dim glow of oil lamps, sagas were spoken aloud, not read, their rhythms memorized and passed on by voice alone. These stories filled the darkness with meaning, transforming fear into familiarity. Tales of gods, spirits, and ancestors acknowledged the night as a powerful force, but one that could be endured through wisdom and unity. Light also defined work. Tasks requiring precision were saved for times when oil was plentiful or when the lamp could be dedicated to a single purpose. Carving, sewing, and tool repair happened close to the flame, hands casting oversized shadows against the walls. Other work, such as grinding grain or sorting supplies, was done by touch, guided by memory rather than sight. Over time, people developed a heightened sensitivity to texture, sound, and movement in low light. The polar night demanded discipline. Lamps were extinguished early when possible, especially during periods of fuel scarcity. Families learned to accept long hours of darkness, retreating to sleep or quiet rest rather than wasting precious oil. This rhythm reduced energy consumption and preserved supplies. Survival was not about constant activity, but about knowing when to remain still. Outside the longhouse, darkness ruled completely. Snow-covered ground reflected faint starlight, allowing limited visibility, but forests and valleys became black voids. Venturing out required confidence and familiarity with the land. Small hand lamps or covered flames were sometimes used, shielded from wind by leather or horn, but these were reserved for urgent needs. Most movement occurred during twilight or under moonlit skies, when natural light offered some guidance. Oil and fat were also central to winter travel and trade. Viking traders and messengers moving between settlements carried small quantities of high-quality oil for light during stops. A reliable lamp meant the difference between safe shelter and dangerous exposure. In remote outposts, oil could be worth as much as food, traded carefully and guarded closely. The physical effects of extended darkness were felt deeply. Without sunlight, bodies weakened, moods darkened, and fatigue grew. The warm glow of a lamp helped counter this, offering not just visibility but emotional relief. Light created a sense of enclosure, a reminder that the human world still existed within the vast winter night. Even a small flame could restore calm after hours of blackness. Spiritual beliefs intertwined with this reliance on light. Fire was seen as a living force, capable of protection and transformation. Lamps were often placed deliberately within the home, near symbolic objects or areas. associated with ancestors. Extinguishing a flame carried weight, sometimes accompanied by quiet words or gestures of respect. Light was never treated as a mere tool, it was a presence. As winter progressed, oil levels dropped steadily. Every household knew roughly how much remained and how long it needed to last. This knowledge influenced decisions large and small, whether to host guests, whether to extend evening work, whether to burn an extra lamp during a storm. Planning became constant, and mistakes could not be undone. The deepest part of the polar night tested these systems. Storms howled outside, sealing doors with snow and ice. Inside, lamps burned steadily, their flames small but defiant. Smoke curled upward into dark rafters, joining layers left by generations before. In that enclosed space, time seemed to slow, measured not by sunrise but by the quiet consumption of oil. Yet even in this depth of darkness, there was balance. The Vikings had shaped their lives to fit the night rather than resist it. They understood that light was temporary, that fuel was finite, and that survival required acceptance as much as effort. By respecting the limits of animal fat and oil, they extended their endurance through the longest winters the North could offer. As the polar night held firm and the cold tightened its grip, the glow of oil lamps continued to define the boundary between human life and the endless dark beyond the walls. Each flame represented preparation made months earlier, animals hunted, resources preserved, and knowledge passed down. It was this quiet mastery of light, refined under pressure, that allowed Viking communities to endure until the first faint return of the sun began to hint at the coming change. By the time the polar night began to loosen its hold, Viking communities had already endured the most demanding test of their year. The return of faint daylight did not immediately bring warmth or ease, but it marked a psychological turning point. Light in the sky, even for a short time, reduced dependence on oil and fat and signaled that survival had once again proven possible. The lamps that had burned steadily through the darkest months now became symbols of endurance rather than desperation. In these final weeks of winter, oil usage was adjusted carefully. Families took advantage of the brief daylight to perform tasks that had been postponed, conserving their remaining fuel for nightfall. Lamps were lit later and extinguished earlier. Even a pale glow filtering through animal skin windows was enough to reduce the strain on stored resources. Every saved drop of oil represented insurance against late storms or unexpected cold. The condition of lamps themselves revealed the cost of winter. Wicks were shortened, bowls were darkened by soot, and metal fittings bore signs of repeated heating and cooling. Yet these objects were rarely discarded. They were cleaned, repaired, and prepared for the next season, just as tools and clothing were. The Vikings viewed lighting equipment as long-term investments shaped by years of use and familiarity. As daylight slowly increased, work patterns shifted. Tasks requiring fine vision moved closer to windows during the brief hours of natural light. This transition eased the pressure on oil supplies and allowed people to work longer without exhausting their fuel. The sun, weak as it was, became a partner again, supplementing what animal fat and oil had provided alone. The survival of the polar night reinforced the importance of preparation and restraint. Every household took stock of what remained, oil reserves, lamp condition, wick materials, and measured them against what had been consumed. This reflection was practical. Rather than sentimental, lessons learned during winter would determine success in the next one. If oil had run low too quickly, hunting strategies would change. If lamps failed too often, designs would be adjusted. The knowledge gained from each winter was cumulative. Viking lighting technology did not advance through sudden invention, but through gradual refinement. Lamp shapes evolved to reduce spillage. Wick materials were tested and improved. Containers were redesigned to prevent freezing or contamination. These small changes, repeated over generations, made the difference between barely surviving and enduring with stability. Light also influenced seasonal movement. As days lengthened, people ventured farther from home, checking traps, surveying land, and reopening paths buried under snow. Lamps still accompanied them, but they were no longer the sole source of visibility. The growing presence of daylight reduced risk and expanded opportunity. Darkness receded, not suddenly, but step by step. The emotional impact of this transition was profound. Months of confinement and shadow had drawn communities inward, intensifying bonds but also tensions. The return of light eased these pressures. Faces once seen only by firelight were now visible in softer, natural illumination. Spaces felt larger, less oppressive. The world expanded beyond the walls of the longhouse. Yet the Vikings did not abandon their respect for darkness. They understood that the polar night would return, as it always had. Light remained a resource to be valued, not taken for granted. Even in spring, lamps continued to be used sparingly. Old habits of conservation lingered, shaped by memories of winter scarcity. Animal fat and oil retained their central role throughout the year. In warmer months, attention shifted back to accumulation. Seal hunts resumed along the coast. Livestock were managed with winter needs in mind. The success of the past polar night influenced decisions about how much fat to store and in what form. Survival was cyclical, and light was woven into that cycle as tightly as food. Cultural memory preserved these experiences. Stories of harsh winters and near failure were passed down, emphasizing the importance of preparation and cooperation. Light featured prominently in these narratives, not as a luxury, but as a lifeline. Lamps symbolized foresight and discipline, qualities admired as much as bravery or strength. The role of light extended beyond practicality into identity. Living at the edge of darkness shaped how Vikings saw themselves. Enduring the polar night distinguished them from southern peoples who never faced such extremes. Their mastery of oil and flame became part of what defined them as northerners, people who could survive where others could not. Archaeological evidence supports this deep integration of lighting into daily life. Soot-stained beams, worn lamp bowls, and residues of animal fat found in longhouses reveal how constant and essential artificial light was. These traces show not moments of crisis, but long-term adaptation, the quiet persistence of families who learn to live within the limits of their environment. The success of Viking exploration and expansion owed much to this mastery. Ships traveling into high latitudes relied on oil for onboard lighting during long nights at sea. Temporary camps used lamps to extend working hours and maintain morale. The same techniques that sustained villages through winter allowed explorers to push farther into the unknown. Even after the polar night ended, its influence remained. People carried forward habits shaped by darkness, measured movements, careful resource use, and a deep awareness of environmental limits. Light had taught restraint as much as it provided vision. The flame, once a defense against overwhelming night, became a reminder of balance. In the end, Viking survival through long polar nights was not the result of a single innovation, but a system built on understanding. Animal fat, oil, and light were managed with precision, respect, and patience. Darkness was not conquered, but negotiated. Each winter, the Vikings proved that endurance did not come from overpowering nature, but from learning how to live alongside it. The polar night receded, the sun climbed higher, and the lamps were used less often. But they were never forgotten. Stored away carefully, cleaned and repaired, they waited for the inevitable return of darkness. When it came again, as it always did, Viking hands would once more shape fat into fuel, wicks into flame, and light into survival, continuing a cycle that defined life at the northern edge of the world.